Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting Live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible. I'm William Bell, and with me, of course, is Don Preston. Don, how are you doing? How's Oklahoma? How's your wife? And how's everything going on in your world?
Well, everything just fine, William. Jan seems to be feeling slightly better, which is a good thing. She's been trying some new medicine, which hasn't worked out really, really well on some levels, but on other ways it's good. So, we're optimistic, hopefully. But everything's just really, really fine. It's been a very, very hectic and a very productive week so far. So we're as always, just enthused and encouraged about the direction of the movement of covenant eschatology and the people that are responding to the message. William, yesterday I got notification that a couple of my videos had a reach of over 5,000 people apiece. That's not on the YouTube enumeration there, but it's on another listing that I had tried, and the website traffic is up, and so just really, really excited about an awful lot of the things that are going on.
Well, it sounds very good, and it's always good to know that the word's getting out there, and people are getting access to the information, and the more we do that, that's helping to both teach and communicate and educate. And when we get that done, it makes everybody's job easier because we have more people enlisting and more people coming aboard to, learn the message and then turn around and share it as well. And, of course, that doesn't fare too well for others, but, it's great news for us.
That's exactly right. Well, William, we are continuing our examination of the speeches that were given at the Bellview Church of Christ lectures that are held every year in Southfleet, Florida. This year, their theme was Refuting Realized Eschatology. We have reviewed and refuted and responded to several of those speeches already. Tonight's program will center on the presentation by one of the speakers. His name is Gene Hill. Now, personally, I don't know the man. I don't even know that I've ever even heard of him. But nonetheless, he was one of the invited speakers. And as you and I were visiting before we came on the air, William, really he said not one thing different from what the other speakers said. It's almost like they all have the same script. They just give it a different title. They make some of the same blatant misrepresentations and charges about what we do or do not believe as preterists. And this is interesting, William. This morning I received a phone call from a minister who is a minister in the Churches of Christ. I won't mention his name, but he's from Oklahoma. And he is a full preterist. And he told me that just recently he had begun teaching on one of the epistles. And, oh my goodness gracious, some of the people that were in the class immediately started charging him with heresy, false doctrine, He is leading the congregation astray. But then, thankfully, there's a group of people that are excited, saying this makes more sense than anything they've ever heard, etc., etc. But he was sharing with me that on Facebook, some of the people of the congregation had already gotten on there talking about him, making accusations about what he supposedly did or did not believe. And one of the things that he was accused of believing, William, is what we will be discussing tonight, the lesson by Gene Hill. Some people had gotten on Facebook and accused him of saying the church did not come into existence in any way at all until AD 70. It just didn't come in. It wasn't even born on Pentecost. And this minister was just incensed. He said, I've never said that. I've never thought that. I've never written that. And he goes, Don, where are these people getting this nonsense? My response to him was, well, they're making it up. They're desperate. They cannot address the real arguments that we are making, so they feel justified in making false charges. I said, this is one of the things that has been the greatest disappointment to me in all of my years now of being involved in the movement of covenant eschatology, and that is that people who call themselves Christians feel that they're justified in making false claims about what we believe or what we don't believe. Another accusation that this minister said he had faced, one accuser said, you're denying the deity of Jesus Christ. And once again, he was going, what? Where in the world did you get this stuff? And once again, I just had to tell him, well, they can't answer what you're actually saying, and so they're willing to make false accusations. And William, that is true in this speech by Gene Hill. He spends a great deal of his time in his presentation. And by the way, it's interesting about Gene Hill that just as you and I have noted about several of the other speakers, that they don't even take up their full allotment of time. This man stopped before his 40 minutes were up, William. I just don't understand that. I mean, you and I as speakers, we don't understand stopping and giving back 8 or 10 minutes of time. How do you do that?
I don't know. It's beyond my ability.
And likewise,
we're always grasping for more.
Absolutely. I sometimes jokingly say that my wife accuses me of not being able to say hello in 25 words or less. So, and she's sitting on the couch going, that's right. But again, I just simply cannot fathom being given an allotment of 40 or even 45 minutes, and yet in 30 minutes or 35 at the absolute most, you have you've ended. You've gone through all your material. Well, anyway, Brother Hill began an awful lot. He actually devoted a good bit of time to arguing from Daniel chapter 9. Now, his argument essentially was this. Daniel 9, and the final analysis of it, was the prediction of the establishment of the kingdom. Well, I don't have a problem with that. What Gene Hill was failing to see, more than obviously, however, is that Daniel 9 was a prophecy of the resurrection of the dead. And what's amazing to me, although it's very, very typical, is that Gene Hill said that all constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9 were fulfilled by Jesus on the cross. Now, that's a fairly common view, but it is absolutely without merit. And I'll just very quickly make this point, William. He said that Jesus fulfilled all 6 constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9 by the time of the cross. And he said he was cut off in the middle of the week. That means it's the middle of the 70th week. And he made the point, tried to make a point. You know, brethren, he said, you've got to realize that many of the arguments that Foy Wallace Sr. made all the way back in his book in the 30s and 40s, in his book, The Prophetic Word, when he was arguing against dispensationalism, he said, it is absolutely amazing that those very arguments apply against these brethren. Well, William, you and I both know how false that argument is. You and I both know that Foy Wallace Sr., in his book, The Prophetic Word, had he been consistent with his arguments that he made in that book, he would have been a full preterist. There's no question about it.
Yeah, that's correct.
Foy Wallace Sr. did some great work against dispensationalism, but I'm telling you what, folks, if you follow through the logic of his argumentation, you wind up being a full preterist.
It was Foy Wallace Jr.
Is that not true, William?
Yes, that's correct. But it was Foy Wallace Jr.
Oh, that's true. I apologize for that. It was Foy Wallace Jr. Yeah,
and,
but again,
many people actually accused him of, being preterist, especially with his book on Revelation. But if you take the book of Revelation and some of his argumentation in God's prophetic word and put them together, I mean, you'd come straight to the preterist position.
And I've had people, and you've had people, who have told us that his books were extremely helpful in bringing them to the view of covenant eschatology.
Well, it was one of maybe the second or third books I had in my library, which was the book of Revelation by Wallace. I think I bought Josephus and Foy Wallace's commentary, or maybe I got his commentary first, and then he referred me to Josephus. And between those two books, that's how I ended up a preterist.
Well, there's no question that his book on Revelation had a profound impact on me as well. I got that very, very early on. Matter of fact, after I had taught on the Olivet Discourse in 1976 and had changed my views on the Olivet Discourse and had come to believe it was United Discourse, talking about exclusively the events leading up to and consummating in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, I was asked to teach a class on the book of Revelation. One of the very first books I got was Foy Wallace's book, and it had a profound impact on me. I found it extremely convincing. So there's no question but what his works certainly helped lead me to covenant eschatology. But anyway, Gene Hill makes the argument that all 6 of the constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9 were fulfilled by Jesus on the cross. Now, I will say this. Gene Hill did no exegesis, none whatsoever, of Daniel chapter 9 and those constituent elements. Now, he would mention the constituent elements and just simply give a reference to some New Testament text, but he would not go to the New Testament text and show why that text has to be the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9. But, William, in Daniel 9, 70 weeks were determined to put away sin. Now, he makes the argument that Hebrews 9:26, that Christ appeared at the end of the age to put away sin. Is that not a convincing argument? Is that a conclusive argument?
In Hebrews chapter 9? In Hebrews 9,
Hello?
you say? Yeah. In Hebrews
9:26, where it says Christ has appeared once at the end of the age to put away sin. Pardon me. Brother Hill is arguing that Jesus fulfilled Daniel 9, that 70 weeks were determined to put away sin.
That's
And
really
he was
interesting.
arguing that Jesus appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Therefore, that fulfills that aspect of Daniel 9:24. But is that correct?
Well, absolutely not. It's a shame that they would use that text, especially in Hebrews chapter 9, which is so typological of the temple typology. It's actually the antitype of the temple typology, and it just is a gross example of taking a single passage out of its context. If you follow the book of Hebrews, and particularly chapter 9, if you just read chapter 9 very carefully, you will see that the whole concept there is the work of the high priest, which involved more than just the slaying of the animal or the sacrifice itself, but the offering of that sacrifice in the most holy place. And then the return of the high priest to bless the people. Well, that's the consummation of the text that he's citing in Hebrews 9 and verse 26, because in verses 27 and 28, he gives you the second part of it. And even though it says Christ appeared in the end of the age, one thing that a good friend of mine, I read an article by him, Ray Hawk, some years ago. He pointed out in Hebrews 9:26, he says he appeared at the end of the age, or in the end of the age, but not at the end of the age. And that statement stuck with me because it was a very, very appropriate analysis of the text. There are a lot of things that happen in the age, in the Jewish age, but not all of them happened at the end of that age. It was in the end of the age, but not at the very end of it. When you look at what happened at the very end of it, that's where we look at verse 28. And that's where the consummation of the sacrifice that was offered by Christ occurs. And of course, you'll be pointing out very shortly why even Gene Hill agrees with that analysis.
Yes, indeed, he does. Folks, I want you to see how shallow Gene Hill's
we
argument is.
We have a caller online too, Don. Let me
go ahead.
Let me make a very... Yeah, you go ahead, and I'll go ahead and talk to him.
Okay, go ahead and screen that caller if you would, find out what they would like to ask. But folks, you have to understand something. And this is true of every single speaker on the Bellview Church Christ lectureship. They cherry pick, as William suggested, they cherry pick a verse here and there, and they think that one verse is the end-all, be-all answer of everything that we as preterists believe. So he goes to Hebrews 9:26. It says Christ appeared at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now, first of all, let me point out, William and I absolutely do not know of any preterist that denies that Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection were all absolutely intrinsically related to, vital to, necessary for the putting away of the sin. But we need to note that even Gene Hill argue that sin is not finally dealt with until when? Until the resurrection. Well, how do I know that? Well, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I'm going to read from the nearly inspired version here, the New International Version. But I'm going to start with verse 54 of 1 Corinthians 15. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Now watch this, ladies and gentlemen. The sting of death is sin. And the power of sin is the law. So the resurrection would be when sin, the sting of death, would be overcome. Does Gene Hill believe that has taken place? No, he does not. Therefore, Jesus initiated the process of putting away sin by his death, burial, and resurrection. He did not consummate the putting away of sin, because Paul posits the putting away of sin at the time of the resurrection, which Gene Hill puts at the so-called end of time. So Gene Hill contradicts himself without even realizing it, as every man on the Bellview lectureship had done and did do in each of their lectures. They make a claim that if you take that claim all by itself in isolation from the rest of the Scriptures, you might be able to justify it. But folks, you don't take an atomistic view of Scripture. You take a holistic view. You take all of the evidence and you add it all up together. And you cannot take the atomistic view of Gene Hill of Hebrews 9:26 and Daniel chapter 9 and be true. So when Daniel 9 verse 24 said 70 weeks are determined to put away sin, you have to take Hebrews chapter 9 as the beginning of the process, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 54 through 56 as the consummation of the process. And since 70 weeks were determined to put away sin, not to just start the process, but to put sin away, that means that the 70 weeks were not fully consummated until the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Therefore, if the resurrection has not occurred, sin has not been put away, the work of Christ is not finished, and oh, by the way, the 70 weeks of Daniel have not been finished. And that means, guess what? Israel remains God's chosen people. And oh, guess what? It also means the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, has not yet been fully established. So you see, Gene Hill contradicts himself. He contradicts Scripture. He just violates everything about Daniel chapter 9. And we haven't even really gotten started yet. Okay, William, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Well, certainly that's a very appropriate analysis on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and that just, really knocks the ball out of the park when we talk about, the end of sin. And, these guys, they don't even believe what they're saying, I don't think, or they don't understand, because, you have a text, for example, in 2 Timothy chapter 1, and verse 10 that talks about death being abolished. Well, they want to make death in 1 Corinthians 15 physical death. But here's a text that says that death has been abolished, and they are forced then to take the view that it's spiritual death. And yet at the same time, they will accuse us of saying that we have no more sin death after 70 A.D., but here's an example where they're taking the position, and we agree that it is sin death in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 10, but they are saying that it was done away in 30 A.D., and yet they have sin continuing on. Well, before we go any further, I want to make sure I get this question on for the gentleman who called in. His name is Josh, and is calling from Tampa. He said he just ran across a couple of our videos. I couldn't. He said mine, but it may have been either one of ours. And he's only been studying covenant eschatology for a couple of weeks, but he says he found it fascinating and wanted to know more. And so he asked a question about Luke chapter 17 and verse 22, and he wanted to know, basically what was our understanding of that text. So when we examine the text, it says, the time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. Now, we've talked about that text before in one of our lessons, and we may have even covered it as we've been doing these Bellview lectures. I can't remember. I know it was a little while back. But, Don, why don't you elaborate a little bit on that context? The time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it, especially within the context of Luke 17. And since we're, talking a little bit about the kingdom, or going to, that's going to fit right in with our subject for today.
Absolutely. it's important to see that the context here of Luke 17 and into chapter 18 is that of persecution. You'll notice that verse 25, Jesus said, the Son of Man must first suffer and be put to death in this generation. Chapter 18, verses 1 and following. And here's a very, very good example of a bad chapter division. It's unfortunate that we have a chapter division here. Jesus taught his disciples that they ought to pray. Why? Well, because of the persecution that was coming, that he was telling them about. If he was going to suffer persecution, they were going to suffer persecution. It is in that context of persecution that Jesus said, the time is coming in which you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man. Well, what could he possibly mean by that? Well, I believe that it means that the time was coming in which they would be persecuted so much, chased from city to city, that as Matthew chapter 10 says they would be. They would be chased from city to city. They would be hated. They would be despised. They would be brought before kings and before governors and before the Sanhedrins, Mark 13, 8, and 9. So this is the time of persecution that was going to be coming on them. And when that persecution came, they would desire to see one of the days in which he was still with them. Because let's think about it. For 3.5 years, the days of the Son of Man, they had peace. They had popularity. They had people bringing them food. They had people supporting them. They had tremendous multitudes going everywhere that they were. Think about the Sermon on the Mountain, for crying out loud. And the thousands upon thousands of people that gathered around Jesus. Think about the multitudes that followed him, even across the Sea of Gadarenes, there to witness him, his teaching, and to listen to his teaching, who came to him to be healed, etc. And so the days of Jesus while he was on earth were by and large very peaceful days. Now, certainly in the latter days, very closing weeks of his life, it wasn't so peaceful, but that's not the point. For over 30 years, it was peaceful and it was harmonious and they were popular. So Jesus, in the context of warning them that they were going to be persecuted, just like he was, he said, you're going to look back and you're going to wish that you could see again the peaceful days of when I was with you. But he said, you're not going to see those peaceful days. Why? Because it was going to be a time of intense persecution. Such intense persecution that the majority of believers would even fall away, according to Matthew chapter 24, verses 10 through 12. And so I believe that's the proper context of understanding Jesus' statement when he said, the days are coming in which you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. And by the way, I want to offer this one more thought. We are told that when you see the references in the Olivet Discourse, all of the parallel passages, that when it's a reference to those days, it's always a reference to the events leading up to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. But when you see the term that day, singular, that it refers to his second coming. And that you just don't ever see these days versus that day, speaking of the time of the first century leading up to the singular coming of the Lord in AD 70. Well, that's simply untrue in the first place. In Matthew 24, immediately after the tribulation of those days, what would they see? Verse 30, they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. What is that? That's the day of the Lord. So right there, in that context, you have it. But in Luke chapter 17, you likewise have it. You have the days that would be like the days of Noah. You have the days that would be like the days of, as it was in the days of Lot. Notice this. It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking, buying, selling, planning, and building. But the day, now notice the days leading up to the day. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and earth and destroyed them all. It will be just like that on the day the Son of Man is revealed. Well, what does it mean? There would be days leading up to that day, just as he says here. So that old argument that says you have days versus day, and days refer to the events leading up to AD 70, the day is the end of time, that's a false argument. It just simply will not work. Wayne Jackson said, arguing on chapter 17, Luke chapter 17, the time is coming in which you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man. And he says they would desire to see the final coming of the Lord. He contradicted his own argument, because Wayne Jackson is a huge proponent of those days versus that day, and that day is always singular of the end of time, never those days. And yet then he goes to Luke 17:22 and says they would desire to see the day of the Lord, the end of time, and yet Luke 17 is using the plural, which he says never refers to the so-called end of time. So Wayne Jackson and others like him contradict themselves when they come to this language and they come to these verses that refer to the days of the Son of Man. And that's probably more than was asked for, but I needed to throw that in there.
Yeah, well, that was excellent. I think another interesting point is if they follow the context all the way through, it will talk about the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And, of course, that day was like the days of Noah, as you were talking about, and like the days of Lot. You know, it says they builded, they planted and married and were given in marriage until the day came. And, of course, that was not the end of time. But the other point about that is, in that day, they were told to flee and not to return to their houses. Now, Alan Hires, who is another, person that has taught on these things, he made the point that the fleeing event is a reference to 70 A.D. And so if they're going to if they take the day when the Son of Man is revealed in Luke 17 and verse 30 to be the time of the return of Christ, which they do, then, of course, according to Hires' argument, which is correct, that the fleeing event of Matthew 24, 15 through 18, as well as Luke 21, refers to the destruction of Jerusalem. So there again, you have it all dovetailing right there in 70 A.D. Are you there, Don? Okay, we lost him last week. We may be losing him again for this week. We've got another caller online as well. So, Don, are you here? Ladies and gentlemen, and the caller, just hold on the line for just a minute. We'll see if we can get Don on, and if we can get Don in, I'll go ahead and take your call. But I wanted to just make sure that we can get him back online before we proceed with your question. We're talking about Daniel 9 and Gene Hill and some of the statements that he made. We've covered, Daniel 9 a little bit on the 70 weeks of Daniel, claiming that, sin was, and not only sin, but all of the elements of Daniel 9 were fulfilled at the cross. And yet we have a tremendous contradiction from Gene Hill on that very point, where he says that the Abomination of Desolation was fulfilled in 70 A.D. Now, that's a rather interesting point, and it's true, because the text says 70 weeks were determined upon your people and upon your holy city. And this was the time in which the destruction was going to take place. When the sanctuary was going to be destroyed, when the Abomination of Desolation would take place, it would be in the end of that age. But also, when he even talks about the putting away of sin, that's a reference to resurrection. And, of course, there again, you have the 70 weeks involved. Ladies and gentlemen, we're waiting on Don. We're just trying to get him back on. I don't know what happened to him, but he has this he's developing this rapture syndrome of late, where he just kind of gets raptured out of the broadcast here. And I want to thank the caller for holding on. We're just having a little bit of technical difficulty here. I'm trying to see if we can get him on. I think he's just hung up, and he's going to try dialing back in. So if you'll just be a little bit patient, we'll come in and we'll get your question and try to get that on the air. And we do appreciate you holding on. So just continue to be patient. Give us a little time, and he should be back in. Okay, he's dialed back in. Let's see if he can come in. Let's see what happens, if we can get him. Done?
I'm here.
All right, very good. Okay, I don't know what happened.
I have no clue what happened, William. I was sitting here, and I was actually watching the screen to make sure that I was not disconnected like I was last week, and sure enough, it kicked off.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got another caller online, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of step out here and take the caller's question, and I'll be back in shortly.
Okay, very good. Well, the point that we've been making here in Luke chapter 17 is that Luke chapter 17, when you look at it in its context, absolutely must be seen within the context of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Everything about it. Look, it says, let those who are on the rooftops not come down. Talking about the so-called end of time event that is over in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. That's kind of a silly exhortation, isn't it? You wouldn't even have time to think about coming down. And so everything about this text has to be seen within the context of the events leading up to and consummating in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is confirmed when we go into Luke chapter 18, when Jesus told a parable of a widow who went to an unbelieving judge who neither respected men or God. But she kept after him, saying, "Avenge me on my adversaries." Now, it's important to see the word avenge there. It's the Greek word ekdekesis. And this is a key word that is used throughout Scripture for the vindication of the martyrs of God. This is a key word. Well, Jesus went ahead to say in Luke chapter 18 that will not God avenge the elect who cry to him day and night? Yes, verily I say unto you, now watch this, he will avenge them speedily or shortly. Greek term, entakai. The Greek term, entakai, only appears 7 times in the New Testament. It never, ever, ever refers to the rapidity of action as opposed to the imminence of action. So Jesus was saying to his apostles in Luke chapter 17 that the time was going to come in which they were going to be persecuted for following him. So the persecution would be so intense that they would desire to see the peaceful, harmonious days of his personal ministry, but they wouldn't see it. Times were going to get really, really bad. They were going to pray for vindication. And guess what? They would receive it in that generation. Because Jesus promised in Matthew 23 that all of the blood of all of the righteous shed on the earth, all the way back to righteous Abel, was going to be judged and vindicated in the first century in the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. When we put all of these scriptures together, like we've already suggested, in a holistic way, instead of just cherry-picking a verse here and there, but tying the verses together that speak of the same theme, they have the same motif, and they have the same time statements, then guess what? You come up with a harmonious picture. So, William, are you back yet? Okay, he must still be visiting with the individual about the question that he possibly has. Well, another constituent element of Daniel chapter 9, it was not only 70 weeks are determined to put away sin, which, as we have already demonstrated, is related to the resurrection, but it says to finish transgression. Now, here's something very, very interesting. Many, many, many scholars, and I'm talking going back into ancient church history, tell us that phrase, to finish transgression, means actually to fill up the measure of sin. I believe that to be the accurate rendition. I believe that to be the accurate meaning of to finish the transgression. Now, if that be the case, Israel's sin was not filled up at the cross. Paul himself tells us in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, as he speaks of the Jewish persecution that was rampant in Judea, but had now spread all the way to Thessalonica, Paul, speaking of the Jews and the Judeans, said, they killed the prophets. they have slain the Lord. They are killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus. And in doing so, Paul says, they do fill up the measure of their sin always, and the wrath of God is come upon them to the uttermost. Now notice that Paul is writing here in approximately 50 to maybe as late as 51 AD, and he said that the Jews were still filling up the measure of their sin at that time. Furthermore, Paul said in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 24, writing to the Colossian Gentile Christians, he said, I now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and I fill up that which is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Now, don't misunderstand Paul here. He wasn't saying that Jesus had not suffered enough. But what he was saying, that his suffering was necessary to fill up the measure of the eschatological suffering on the followers of Jesus. There was a measure of sin, i.e. persecuting the church. There was a measure of suffering, i.e. becoming martyrs. And it is depicted as God having cups. The one cup is the sin of the persecutors, and as they persecuted the righteous, their sin of persecution went into that cup. There was another cup, the cup of suffering, and the blood of the martyrs went into that cup. There was another cup. It's the cup of wrath. It is the cup of wrath that when the cup of sin and the cup of suffering both reached to being filled to the brim, God's cup of wrath was likewise filled up, pardon me, and he poured out his wrath on the persecutors. So that's what Paul has in mind in Colossians 1 and verse 24 when he says, I fill up in my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions or the sufferings of Christ. By the way, this is not a distinctive preterist doctrine. Non-preterist scholars have seen this for literally centuries. This is a fairly commonly held view. So here's my point. Gene Hill said that Jesus fulfilled all constituent elements of Daniel 9:24 at the cross. No, because finish the transgression meant to fill up the measure of sin. Israel did not fill up the measure of sin at the cross. Israel filled up the measure of sin by persecuting the church after the church was established. She was still filling up the measure of sin by persecuting Paul, and by the time Revelation was written, John could describe Babylon, which is the city where the Lord was slain, by the way, Revelation 11, verse 8, as holding a cup full of the blood of the saints and of the prophets and of the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So again, instead of taking one verse and taking it out of context, which is exactly precisely what Gene Hill has done, we take the holistic approach and we see what the entirety of the testimony of Scripture is, and we say, to finish transgression meant to fill up the measure of sin. Israel did not fill up the measure of sin at the cross. Israel was filling up the measure of sin and persecuting Paul. Israel had filled up the measure of sin by the time John wrote Revelation, and therefore judgment was about to fall. Therefore, guess what? The 70 weeks were about to be fulfilled when John wrote Revelation, because the transgression was now full. And transgression was about to be taken away. Yes.
All right, let me interject right here because this is an appropriate place to segue into the question that was asked. And, I'm really delighted. This is an exciting program today because we're getting some really good questions in, and we thank those who are calling in. Now, let me also explain. Now, I know it would be a lot more dynamic for these individuals to come on and to ask their own questions. But because we're dealing with the subject, and especially within the churches of Christ, that is so volatile, and because the ramifications for expressing a person's conviction, even while they are studying, can be so detrimental to their careers, we simply don't want to expose people openly if they have not, reached all their conclusions. They're studying. And so we want to be patient with them and give them the opportunity to come to their own conclusions until they are settled in their own minds, and that's why I'm screening the calls. And of course, we've had some rather interesting people to call in, and we had to screen some of them. But these calls that we're getting today really should have been on the air. But I did talk to the individuals and to find out where they were, because we didn't want to just put them out there on blast while they're studying. To give them an opportunity to grow and to study and to to get to where they need to be. But we have another gentleman.
William, you're fading out on your sound.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have another gentleman who asked the question pertaining to the 70 weeks of Daniel. And, of course, his concern was the fact that we generally teach against those who argue for a gap theory on Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks. And yet, when we talk about what transpired with Jesus on the cross and then what happened in 70 A.D., it appears that we have a gap. And so he wanted to have that addressed to help him along, his studies on Daniel 9. And so I know that, you are very well capable of, responding to that question. So why don't you go ahead and talk about it? I had asked him had he studied the feast days, and he did indicate that he had briefly looked at them, but, wasn't confident in that just yet. So why don't you give us a little bit of explanation of the 70 weeks in terms of, is there a gap between the 69th and the 70th week, and how do we account for the time that you've just been explaining with the events at the cross and then the events in 70 A.D.?
Yes, and we, like William said, we just absolutely are thrilled when people call in. We certainly will not expose anyone who is in the process of studying, but who, if maybe their constituents, members of the congregation, knew that they were interested and they were studying, it would be a danger to their career. So we will certainly protect that confidentiality. But we do appreciate you calling in and allowing us to address the questions. In regard to Daniel 9, first of all, there is not a gap between the 69th and the 70th week. I am a firm believer that there is not a gap. There is, however, an interval. If you wish to call it a gap, that's fine. But there is an interval between the first half of the 70th week and the last half. And this gap, this interval, the secret to this is to be found in Israel's feast days. Now, at the 2013 Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, which was on the Temple of God, I have one entire lesson that will delineate this in a whole lot fuller form. But let me give just a very, very, very brief outline. In Israel's festal calendar, there were 7 feast days. You had Passover, unleavened bread, Feast of Weeks, and Pentecost. Those first 4 weeks were at the very beginning of their calendar. From Pentecost until the next feast day was a period of 4 months, 120 days. The next feast day, was Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, which symbolized and foreshadowed the Day of Judgment, followed by the Day of Atonement, which was inextricably tied up with the Day of Judgment, according to the Jewish rabbis. That was followed by the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Tabernacles, which symbolized the resurrection at the end of the age. Technically speaking, they then celebrated Shemini Atzeroth. Now, don't ask me if that's pronounced correctly. Probably is not. But it was a feast to celebrate the completion of the official 7 feast days, that Israel celebrated that day because it was the feast of the new creation. It was the feast of new life. Pardon me. Okay. Look at Daniel chapter 9. After the 69th week, Messiah would be cut off. This is the Passover. So right here in Daniel chapter 9, we have reference to the very first of the feast days of Israel. What do we find in verse 27? the time of judgment, the overwhelming flood of the end of the 70th week. The full end, as some translations say, the full end thereof shall be with a flood. What is the countdown in Daniel chapter 9? It's the 70 weeks. He's just given us after 7 weeks. Then he's given us after 69 weeks. Now he says the full end. The full end of what? The 70 weeks. And the full end thereof shall be with a flood, an overwhelming flood. But what is that 70th week? It's the judgment, which means it's the consummation of the atonement process, which means it's the time of the resurrection. See, these last 3 feast days follow bang, 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 or bang, 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 to give that appropriately and accurately. So here's what I'm saying. In the middle of the week is when Messiah would be cut off. In the middle of that 70th week. After the 69th week, Messiah would be cut off. So when's Messiah cut off? In the 70th week. In the middle of the week, guess what? He'll make a firm covenant for many with one, or he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. What is that causative factor? His death. So I take his death in the middle of the week. But you see, the full end, you now have this 70th week. You now have this waiting for the judgment. So you have the Pentecost, which is the 4th feast, and now you have what? The waiting for the judgment. You have the full outplaying of the 70th week in the fullest sense of the word. So you have the initiation of the 70th week at the cross, is the way that I see it. And then you have Pentecost, which is here the last of the first 4 feasts. Interestingly enough, Peter says in Acts chapter 3, speaking to that crowd at the temple, repent and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out, and that he, that is God, pardon me, may send Jesus, and that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord. The term refreshing there is from the Greek word onyxousios, and it means relief. It means respite from judgment. It is a word that is used in Exodus chapter 8, in which Pharaoh begged for relief from the plagues, and God gave him relief. So here is Peter immediately after Pentecost telling Israel that if they will repent, guess what? They will receive relief from the coming judgment. But they were in the midst of that 4-month period, if you please, that symbolic period of time. By the way, 4 months, 120 days. A 3-fold division of 40, or a 4-fold division of 30, if you please, is the number 40 symbolic in Israel's mindset? Well, anybody that knows anything about Hebraic thought knows it is. So that 120 days was highly symbolic, highly figurative, highly typological of that period from Pentecost, the last of the first 4 feasts, until the day of judgment. The day of judgment was in AD 70. It is the consummation of the atonement, as we've already talked about in the putting away of sin, the time of the resurrection, the Feast of Sukkot. Now, pardon me, there is so much involved in this, and I still have so much to learn on this, but this is one of the most exciting, thrilling studies that I've ever been involved in all of my life. But when we look at Daniel 9 through the prism of the feast days, then there's supposed to be an interval. There is supposed to be a period of time from Pentecost, the Feast of the Feast of First Fruits, there's supposed to be an interval, if I may express it like this, there's supposed to be an interval between the Passover and the resurrection, between the initiation of the feast days and the consummation of the feast days. That is Israel's festal calendar right there in Daniel chapter 9. And I would suggest that the dispensational view of a gap between the 69th and the 70th week is clearly inappropriate, because they say that Jesus' death suspended the prophetic countdown when Daniel emphatically, explicitly, and specifically says that Jesus' death would be after the 69th week. Well, what comes after 69 if you're counting to 70? This clearly puts the death of Jesus within the 70th week. But it also means, guess what? There's got to be an interval before the judgment comes.
Don, let me come in a little bit on that as well.
Yes.
One of the reasons why is because if you go back to Leviticus 23, and you may have covered this and I might have missed it, but when you go back to Leviticus 23, you will notice that all of the feast days, with the exception of one of them, occur within the month. In other words, you always knew the day that they were going to occur because they were on like set days within the month. However, the Feast of Trumpets was a day that happens on the first of the month, and that was a feast where they never knew precisely when the first day of the month was going to occur. And thus, they had to have watchers who would go and watch for the new moon and then return to the priest to communicate that information, at which time they could sound the trumpet so that they could begin the Feast of Trumpets and then go on to complete the rest of the feast days in that connection, the Day of Atonement and then Tabernacles as well. And this is what's behind the statement in Matthew 24 and verse 36. But of that day and hour knows no man. It's also indicated in verse 31, basically states that the very same thing Jesus stated in Matthew 24:36, which is after the so-called division, is before verse 35 and before verse 34 in verse 31, because the sounding of the trumpet alludes to that point. But the issue there is that was the day that was not known. And if you look at the book of Acts, you will see that when Jesus talks to them and they ask him the question, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? He says it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put in his own power. Now, what that says is there was not a gap in terms of when the times and seasons were going to come. It was simply the fact that period, as Dunn was explaining before, was that period in which they were waiting for that day to be revealed. They were watching and waiting for that time to be revealed. And, of course, it's revealed when the Father gives them, the additional information and lets them know. But that that follows the very feast days that Don has been talking about for the last, 3 or 4 minutes. And that's why. So if you go back and look at Leviticus, you can see all the other feast days happen within the month, whereas the Feast of Trumpets happened at the first of the month, and they could not begin that until they knew when. And that's why you have what appears to be a gap, but there is no gap. It's simply following the very pattern of the feast days.
And let's clarify what we mean when we say that a gap. Dispensationalists use the word gap in the sense that it was unplanned, it was not predicted, it was not part of God's original scheme. But because of the Jewish unbelief, God suspended the prophetic calendar, the prophetic countdown. We reject that concept. What we're saying is there was indeed a gap. There was an interval in the prophetic countdown that is directly related to part and parcel of Israel's festal calendar. When and only when, and if and only if, we consider the festal calendar and use it as a template on Daniel 9, does Daniel work out? Look, folks, the caller who was asking about this gap is not alone. And William and I have pondered the gap for years and years and years. When I began to consider the feast days, and I shared it with William, he was as excited about it as I was, because we both struggled with it. We both struggled with it so much. And everyone who has tried to be a good, serious Bible student about Daniel 9 has struggled with it. I believe the feast days are the answer to this question. And William, I believe we're out of time. I hope that the information that we have given on tonight's program has been helpful to our callers and to our listeners. We have not certainly gotten through all of Gene Hill's lessons, so we'll pick it up again next week. Folks, tell your friends, tell your neighbors about Fulfilled Radio. Invite them to be a part of our programming. Invite them to call and ask their questions. We'll do our best to give you a Bible answer right here on Two Guys in a Bible, voice you can trust. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.